Remember buying video games? Like way back when, you'd get the entire game, no extra charges, just the whole thing.
Yeah.
Now it seems like every game wants a piece of your wallet, even after you've already bought it.
It's crazy.
So today, we're going to take a deep dive into how video game monetization has evolved between 2005 and 2025.
Okay.
How did we get from there to here? And how's that impacted the games we actually get to play?
Interesting.
Now, you sent me some fascinating sources on this, and they really highlight how gaming has shifted from this passion-driven creative industry to a more, well, corporate and profit-focused model.
Right.
It's a big shift, and it seems like indie games versus AAA titles have been impacted in totally different ways. Plus, there's that whole case of Titanfall 2, which, from what I read, had great monetization but totally flopped initially. So, to kick things off, let's go back to like 2005. Think about it. You'd walk into a store, buy a game, and that was it. Done deal.
Simple.
Right. The whole game, just waiting to be played. No DLC, no season passes, just a finished product. It seems kind of simpler from where we are now.
Yeah, it was definitely a different landscape. I mean, for developers, it meant they had one shot to get it right? No patching major bugs after release.
So much pressure.
It was. Looking back, it's almost like a lost art in some ways.
So let's dig into how things changed. Between 2005 and 2025, gaming went from, here's the whole game, to, I don't know, what did it become? One of the sources even said it feels more like subscribing to a service than actually buying a product.
I think that's a really good point. The rise of downloadable content, DLC and season passes, and then the whole thing with battle passes.
Battle passes, yeah.
It really created this feeling of like never-ending spending. Like you're always playing catch-up, always paying for something.
Right, and just so everyone's on the same page, what is a battle pass? It's basically a tiered reward system, but there's a time limit. So you have to play constantly or you miss out on stuff and you've already paid for it.
It's totally preying on that fear is missing out thing, that FOMO.
FOMO, exactly. It's so powerful. It makes you feel like you have to keep up with everyone else, especially in gaming where, everyone's online and connected.
Yeah, you don't want to be the one who's left behind.
So the business model completely flipped. Instead of convincing you to buy the game up front, developers are now focused on getting you hooked and then keeping you engaged. And of course, spending more money.
It's about maximizing what they call the lifetime value of a player. Like, how much can they get out of each player? Not just from one game, but maybe across all their games. That's the big question now.
So we've got this constant need to spend, and it's all feeding off of our fear of missing out. What does that actually mean for the games themselves? How did they change?
Well, one thing you see is that games often launch in a less finished state.
Really?
They're relying on patches and updates to fix things later on, which, kind of ties into the monetization strategy because it lets them release content in bits and pieces.
Oh, to keep players engaged and spending.
Exactly.
So it's less about selling a complete game and more about managing this live service, this evolving world. Doesn't that seem kind of risky? What if players just get fed up, like the game's too buggy or they feel like they're constantly being nickel and dimed?
It is risky, and we've seen a lot of backlash against some games that had really aggressive monetization strategies, but for some publishers, it seems like the rewards outweigh the risks, especially if they have a big, dedicated player base. And that actually brings us to the examples you mentioned earlier, Titanfall 2 and Madden.
Oh, right. Titanfall 2 is such an interesting case. It gets brought up all the time in these discussions. Didn't it have like a really fair monetization system? No pay-to-win stuff, just optional cosmetic things.
Yeah.
But then it flopped.
Right, Titanfall 2. It's almost like a warning story in the gaming world, right?
Yeah.
Got great reviews, everyone loved gameplay, super fast-paced, innovative mechanics, and like you said, the monetization wasn't greedy at all, but it just didn't sell.
And from what I read, it was partly because of EA, the publisher. They messed up the release timing, putting it right between two other huge shooter games. What bad luck.
Awful. It shows that even a great game with good monetization can still fail. Bad marketing, bad timing. Sometimes you just need a little luck to break through.
It's kind of depressing.
Yeah.
So it's not enough to just make a good game. You need the marketing, the timing, all that stuff. But then we have Madden, which seems to do the opposite of everything we just talked about. and it still does amazingly well.
Yeah, Madden is a whole different story. It's known for releasing basically the same game every year, just tiny updates, heavy microtransactions, especially in that Ultimate Team mode.
But it sells like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
It makes you wonder, do gamers even care about fair monetization? Or are we just used to it now? Like we expect to pay extra for everything?
It's a big question, and it leads us to the heart of this whole deep dive. What are we valuing as players? Are we supporting the games and the experiences we actually want, or are we just going along with whatever the industry throws at us?
That's a really good question, one we should definitely explore further. But before we do, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, the difference between how indie games and AAA games have navigated this whole monetization shift.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast.
We'll jump into that right after this. We were just talking about Madden and how it seems to do so well, even though a lot of players don't like how it's monetized. But the sources you gave me also highlight how differently things are going in the indie game world.
Yeah, the indie scene is fascinating. In a lot of ways, they've resisted this trend toward really complicated monetization. They're putting out complete games right from the start, polished experiences.
You mean like the whole game is right there when you buy it?
Exactly. Think about games like Hollow Knight, Hades, Stardew Valley. Those were all made by small teams, driven by passion.
Indie devs are definitely passionate.
They really are, and I think that's a big reason why those games were so successful. They gave players a fulfilling experience without always asking for more money.
It's like they went back to that 2005 model we talked about, right? Buy the game, get the whole game, no strings attached. But you keep bringing up passion. Do you really think that makes a difference in the end? Does it make the game better?
I really do think so. When developers are passionate about a project, they put so much care into it. It's not just a job, it's their vision. And players can feel that. They know when a game's made with love.
That's a great point, and it seems to be working for a lot of indie devs. They're making these amazing games, getting critical acclaim, and they don't have to resort to all those crazy monetization schemes. It's refreshing, honestly.
It is. It shows that there's a real hunger for these kinds of games that respect players' time and money. It gives me hope for the future of gaming.
Me too. Speaking of hope, you also sent me a list of the top 10 games that got monetization right. And it wasn't just indie games on there. Some big AAA titles made the cut too. Should we take a look?
Definitely. This list is a perfect example of how even the big studios can deliver value to players and still be commercially successful.
The first one that jumped out at me was The Witcher 3. It's huge, right? Hundreds of hours of content. And CD Projekt Red, the developers, released a bunch of DLC expansions, but they were free. That just blows my mind.
I know, it's almost unheard of these days, right? Especially for a AAA game like that.
So generous.
They really were. They understood that if they created a complete and enjoyable experience, it would ultimately benefit them in the long run.
And it did. The Witcher 3 sold incredibly well, and people loved that they got all that extra content for free. It really proves that you don't have to squeeze every penny out of players to be successful. Another one that caught my eye was Cyberpunk 2077. It had a really rough launch.
Oh yeah, super buggy.
But CD Projekt Red actually put in the work to fix it. They released tons of patches and updates, and they didn't charge extra for any of it.
It's so important. I mean, they could have easily turned those fixes into paid DLC, but they chose to regain players' trust. It's a lesson in accountability, which is something we don't always see.
Yeah, they owned up to their mistakes and actually fixed the game. And it worked. Cyberpunk 2077 is doing really well now. People appreciate that they put in the effort. It's like, honesty is the best policy.
For sure. It builds trust, which is essential for developers and players.
Okay, so we've got The Witcher 3 being super generous with DLC and Cyberpunk 2077, showing some real accountability. What other games from that top 10 list stood out to you?
Two others that come to mind are Elden Ring and God of War, Ragnarok. They were both praised for being complete games right from the start.
Just like pure gaming experiences.
No microtransactions, no season passes, just a fantastic game. It's almost revolutionary these days.
Here's the game, enjoy it. That should be the standard, right? But these were huge releases, major AAA titles. Do you think their success means the industry's shifting back towards this model? Or are they just anomalies?
It's hard to say. I hope their success encourages other developers to think about a more player-friendly approach.
Fingers crossed. Because right now it feels like we're at a crossroads. On one hand, we have these great examples of games done right. But on the other hand, we have tons of games that are still all about microtransactions and battle passes.
It's a constant battle, isn't it? Creating a great experience versus making as much money as possible. It's a conversation that goes beyond games, honestly. Movies, music, streaming, it's everywhere.
You're right. It's like this whole trend of how can we get the most out of consumers? It makes you wonder, what's the future of entertainment going to look like?
A very good question.
But let's focus back on games for now. We've talked about how monetization evolved, how the indie scene is kind of doing its own thing. And there are some glimmers of hope from the AAA world. What are your overall thoughts on where gaming is headed?
I think it's a time of transition. There's definitely a growing awareness of the issues surrounding monetization, and players are starting to speak up about what they want.
And we'll dive into that right after this. Okay, so we were talking about how players are starting to become more aware of these monetization issues. Do you think that's going to make a difference in the long run?
I think it's already making a difference. Gamers are savvier now. They're recognizing when they're being manipulated, and they're demanding more for their money.
Yeah, it's not like you can just slap a battle pass on a half-baked game and expect everyone to gobble it up. Those days are over. Players are starting to vote with their wallets, supporting developers who are actually giving them a good experience.
Absolutely. And the success of those indie games we were talking about, the backlash against some of those really aggressive AAA practices, it all points to a possible shift in the industry.
Like we're at this tipping point where players have more power than ever before.
Yeah. And it's not just about individual choices, it's about creating a community that values ethical practices, speaking up, sharing information, supporting the developers who are doing things right. It all matters.
At the beginning of this deep dive, we were reminiscing about how simple things were back in 2005. You bought a game, you got the whole experience, no strings attached. Do you think we could ever go back to that?
I don't think we'll ever fully go back. The industry's changed too much. The market's different, player expectations have evolved. But that doesn't mean we can't aim for something better.
So what does better look like?
More transparency from developers, clear communication about what you're getting for your money and what might cost extra, and a focus on making games that are actually fun and engaging without relying on all those manipulative tactics.
So basically, respecting players' time and money, treating them like people, not just walkable wallets.
Exactly. And recognizing that a game's value isn't just about the price tag. It's about the whole experience, the emotions, the memories, the connections you make.
That's a great way to put it. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
Remember that you have a voice. You have the power to shape the future of gaming. Support the developer you believe in, demand better from the industry, and most importantly, don't ever lose sight of what made you love games in the first place.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of gaming monetization. It's definitely a complex issue.
It is.
But it's something we all need to be thinking about and talking about. And hey, listener, let us know what you think. What are your hopes for the future of gaming? What can we all do to make sure that games stay fun and entertaining for years to come? Head over to our social media channels and let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, game on.